During the summit, the U.S. presented the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity. Which aspects of the proposal should yield larger cooperation in the Americas?
There was a lot that was left to be determined in that announcement. It sounded nice, and there were some very promising ideas and promising reform suggestions. But first of all, some of it's going to require follow-up from the United States. One of the things the United States was saying was rethinking and reforming and bolstering the Inter-American Development Bank, but that was left dangling. The second is the idea of nearshoring, which is obviously, helping companies move closer to the United States or relocate. And in the region where the U.S. has a number of free trade agreements, not just now the USMCA, but also CAFTA-DR, the Central American Free Trade Agreement with the Dominican Republic, Colombia, Peru, Panama, Chile. So, there's a lot of opportunities there. I thought what was enticing was this idea of trying to offer incentives to try to encourage foreign companies to relocate. That would provide jobs. And the truth is when we look at the ways in which people climb out of poverty, of course, education matters. Of course, social safety nets matter. But in the past, especially in the 2000s, the surest ticket out of poverty was access to a formal job. Okay, and we saw that from the expansion of the middle class in 2000, which has since shrunk somewhat. But here's the problem: is that also that idea of partnership also depends on a certain amount of cooperation on the part of governments south of the U.S. border. And as you know, Alejandra, I was recently in Mexico, and I spoke to a number of businesses, a number of academics, and one of the things that was struck me is repeated stories I heard that there's not that much interest within the Mexican government for this sort of thing, that there's not much of a hearing that the private sector gets with Los Pinos. I know that the government doesn't operate out of there now, but with AMLO, let's say, on issues of critical issues to allow for nearshoring, regulatory changes, tax breaks, land concessions, those sorts of things. While there may be appetite from businesses to relocate from China, South Korea, far lands, there's not, that requires a little bit more marketing and sales job, which from what I heard isn't occurring in Mexico. So there's that problem, first of all. The second is you're right, there are, there's coming out of COVID, we've seen long-term scarring effects of COVID in terms of people, children not effectively attending school or dropping out of school. Entrance into the labor markets have been delayed by 1 or 2 years, and we know from studies in the past that the longer a labor market entrance stays outside of the market or doesn't get integrated, the more likely it will remain that they will become permanently unemployed, and that needs to happen quickly. And I think that for that sense, the Partnership for Prosperity is a good way to do that. And we do have the foundation of free trade agreements to allow for that. The question is again, what is going to happen in terms of social programs, with the exception of Mexico, which has spent very stingily, but is coming out of the COVID era in a pretty good spot in terms of its public debt, thanks to AMLO's conservatism on that. Other countries are going to have difficulty finding fiscal programs to build out social programs, to build out health programs. One of the encouraging things that did come out of the summit too was this idea of lose 500,000 health workers, which is an idea which I think is very exciting, because it's not just providing, if you will, sort of foot soldiers in the combat for healthcare, localized access to healthcare. It's also jobs. And I remember hearing a long time ago that now deceased Harvard professor Paul Farmer talk about, how many health concerns could be addressed by educating basically first responders, if you will, who don't need college education, but can be trained to serve as access points for healthcare. And I think that was very exciting to come out of this. And so there's certain preparation. The issues of food security came up, and I thought that was very, very important too. We're seeing this, it was talked about when I was in Mexico, because Mexico imports so much of its food. And there are obviously and obviously it's a real issue for Caribbean countries and Central American countries. And then you have some very large food exporters, Brazil, Argentina, and the like, that can help supplement that. So the idea of creating, in this case, a truly integrated or much more integrated market on food can help resolve some of the issues of food insecurity that are looming very large, and the United Nations, I think just yesterday, warned about. So yeah, there are some very promising nuggets there, but I think a lot is still yet to be determined and unveiled. And we hope, these summits serve the purpose of, for one moment, gathering together an entire government. We had the trade secretary there, the USTR representative, rather, the commerce secretary, secretary of state, vice president, president. You had members of Congress, other members in the State Department were there. It's a great opportunity to focus attention on. I just hope that doesn't disperse, and that there is some follow-up and sustained momentum on a number of these initiatives.
What is the role for the U.S. in the Americas in the medium and short terms? And how does the future of the region seem in terms of integration vis-a-vis exclusion?
I think the U.S.'s influence is waning in the hemisphere. I think it's been declining for a long time. I think the summit was a sign of that. I personally think, because the United States didn't do a lot of the diplomatic preparation that was necessary before the summit, it allowed President AMLO to be able to score, I think, a very large, important point, and the U.S. still went forward with it. The event, but people spoke mostly about the absences of a number of governments, and I think a sign of the U.S.'s declining influences. For example, in the case of Brazil, it had to promise to President Bolsonaro a bilateral meeting between President Biden and Bolsonaro just to get him there. Sort of like, please come to our event. Like, please come to my party. I swear it'll be good. Get free food. And then, now the U.S. is trying to put the best face on AMLO's trip to Washington in July. But the truth is he really kind of stiff-armed the United States on the summit, and then he's still going to be welcomed, and there'll be, and the truth is what we're seeing is that the U.S., because of these free trade agreements, because of its commitments, because of proximity, is actually in a far weaker position in Latin America than I think many people assume. There's, well before you were born, Alejandra, there was a lot of academic literature about the hegemonic position of the United States. It could do anything it wanted in the hemisphere, and they all had to put up with it, which is true. But now, by weaving together free trade agreements, by partnering on the combating drugs, by the migration, the spike in migration, the U.S. is actually in a far weaker position. It has to cooperate with these governments in ways that even if the governments don't go to its party, it still has to cooperate with them. And that's an interesting, and by the same token, we see the rise of China, and China has a great deal to offer in terms of Latin American economies, because it's coming with cash. It's a command economy. You can walk around, open up its pockets and say, okay, it doesn't always deliver. And we can argue whether that's a wise investment, whatever, but it is delivering infrastructure, which is one of the huge deficits within Latin America and has been. If you look at the IDB, one of the huge problems was that it never really dedicated itself, compared to the Asian Development Bank, to filling infrastructure deficits. And now the Chinese are coming along with their Belt and Road Initiative. Argentina, by the way, has just said it's going to sit in on the BRICS meeting, the meeting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. I don't know why they still have a meeting, though. It never really did much. But the fact that Argentina is interested, it demonstrates clearly the tide is turning. And the U.S. simply, by its democratic nature, by the fact that it's driven by a private sector that operates independently, is not in the position to sort of compete in equal terms with China, and China's playing a long game. So I do think the U.S.'s influence is in decline, and in ways, again, whether it's on drugs, whether it's on migration, and there was another positive development that came out of the summit. You didn't ask this question, but I'm going to answer it anyway, because I know the answer, Alejandra, is that the migration pact and that came out, and that was important because the U.S. defined migration as a regional problem, stemming not just from the northern tier countries or Mexico crossing the border, but also now we see that 6 million Venezuelans have fled 2 million in Colombia, but also Ecuador, Chile. And we're seeing backlashes in some of these countries, not all, and some of them, Colombia's done a very good job of integrating and welcoming these, but we're also seeing Haitians leave. And now with the rise of food insecurity, this is a hemispheric problem. But the truth is the U.S. needs a cooperation of its neighbors to be able to do that. And ironically, the biggest sending countries, the biggest, not per capita, the biggest sending countries of migrants to the United States, the northern tier countries of Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, and of Venezuela, we're not there. We're not at the summit. So it's good, but you have to address the root causes. Again, I think it would have been good to have a number of the countries there to talk about the issues of human rights and political deterioration, decay, repression that is driving these economic declines in places like Venezuela and places like Nicaragua, to try to address the root causes, but they weren't there. So what the U.S. is confronted with is a hemisphere in which it no longer calls all the shots, but yet it has a lot at stake at ensuring the prosperity, stability, and security of the region.
How do you see China's intentions to acquire greater influence in the region affecting notions and efforts of hemispheric integration?
The U.S. has sort of, especially with Trump, but it's carried over, has defined its relationship with China in largely competitive now, even conflict-oriented terms about competition, geopolitical competition. And the truth is for many countries in Latin America, and despite anti-Americanism in Latin America, actually positive attitudes towards the United States, minus Mexico, actually, but for reasons. It was actually quite high, globally speaking. And a lot of that is associated with trade, and a lot of it's associated with migration, actually, which obviously has deteriorated those positive feelings. But the point being is the U.S. does have reserve of goodwill and soft power in the hemisphere vis-a-vis China. But by drawing the line so starkly, it's us or the Chinese or whatever, it does tend to be self-defeating. And a number of Latin American diplomats talk about strategic ambiguity or neutrality. The idea of trying to play one off the other. I mean, why not? It doesn't, just because we want that bridge from China doesn't mean we want to be in China's orbit. We'd still like to have a free trade agreement with the United States. We'd still like to, and so there's going to be a lot of that. And I think because while the divisions may be sharper and more challenging in places like, say, close to China, where it's obviously trying to expand its sphere of influence within Asia, also in Africa. In the Western Hemisphere, there's a little more space and a little more respect, I think, for U.S. influence, and I think there's a little more reserve of goodwill towards the United States, notwithstanding, obviously the anti-Americanism that we all see, but culturally, there's a very personal, familial, social fabric that connects the hemisphere that can't be torn by China. And so I think the U.S. risks generating conflict in China in the Western Hemisphere, ruining its own relationship in the hemisphere. It has to respect that countries, to quote a diplomat, said, "We're not a group of teenagers. You don't have to act like we're going on a date with someone and something bad could happen. We know what we're doing." Now, that we could argue that some countries have obviously been taken advantage of, Venezuela and its oil deals with China, but that's, those are not the democracies, those are not U.S. allies. So I do think the United States, needs to give a certain amount of autonomy for countries to determine their own pace. And I do think that China's mostly what China's looking for more than anything is it wants to flip a few of the remaining countries that recognize Taiwan instead of Beijing. The largest share of those are actually the Caribbean, Central America. It does need access to natural resources, and it's getting those. Now we see China's the number one trade partner for Brazil, or export market for Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru. It's getting those. But it's also looking for votes in the UN or multilateral, just like Russia got when it came to Latin American votes in the UN over removing Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. A lot of countries voted against or abstained. That's what China's looking for. It's not looking at a beachhead in the United States. And so I think the United States needs to chill out a little bit on this one, allow it for a certain amount of space. So I don't see this as a direct sort of zero-sum game, at least in the hemisphere. I think what the United States does have to do, and we talked about partnership, Alejandra, I'm going to trot out a term that I mocked earlier, but it is begin to talk and listen to what some of these countries need. In the short term, many of them are facing real risks of inflationary shocks that are out of their control because of supply chain crises and because of gasoline or fuel and food spikes. The United States needs to be responsive on those and work with the existing multilateral institutions like the IDB to be able to do that. Now, we saw AMLO and others try to resurrect CELAC as a competitor, which CELAC pointedly does not include Canada and the United States as the alternative. And Foreign Minister Ebrard even said this while in Los Angeles. The truth is, there's not much substance to CELAC. It says it has tiene más cumbres que una cordillera. I mean, it has more summits than the Andes, basically. It doesn't do anything. It isn't a replacement. But having said that, the OAS is definitely damaged. I mean, countries are pulling out. It's become politicized. There needs to be some coordinated effort to try to remake an effective multilateral institution that does embody some shared norms. Countries won't agree on everything. But there are many good things, for example, about the OAS, including the Inter-American System of Human Rights, that should be preserved.
In this context, what is the future of mechanisms for cooperation in the Americas?
I don't think the answer is a quick summit in Los Angeles. I don't think the answer is CELAC either. But I think it does. We need to take a step back and reflect. The summit wasn't a complete disaster. It did achieve many things, and I think the U.S. showed a remarkable degree of partnership and imagination in some of these areas. But I think it's necessary to sort of take a step back and think about how we can begin to reimagine this. And part of this will require governments to understand their commitments to defend democracy and to respect commitments that have been made to not include flagrantly human rights violating non-democratic regimes, or at least to work with them in ways. There's plenty of scope for opportunity to engage in them, but to embrace them, I think, is a tragedy. I can't imagine what AMLO did would have sat too well if the same countries had been in the 1970s, Chile's under Pinochet, Argentina under the junta, or say Brazil under the military government. And we have to recognize that non-democracies come in many ideological forms, simply because they may be or purport to be of the left. To be honest, I'm not sure Daniel Ortega or Nicolas Maduro share many progressive values, whether it comes to women's rights or LGBT rights or the environment or any of those things. So I don't know why we label them as left, but I think we need to understand that threats to democracy come from both sides of the ideology, the U.S. can be much more humble in this, and maybe that would create some space for more cooperation. But I also think it needs, to use an example I like to cite is, can you imagine if there were a coup d'état in Italy and the EU, the European Union, decided, you know what, let's just invite Italy anyway. Yeah, we have the democracy clause, but screw that. We're next door neighbors. We like their food. They're great. Just invite them anyway. Multilateral institutions don't work that way. And the summit, for all of its flaws, and it has many, should have been respected for its basic commitments from the beginning. And it hasn't had many successes. But as a club of democracies, I think it was unique. And hopefully other countries can help to sustain it. And hopefully there could be some scope in doing this in a way that does inspire the sort of reflection that you and I just talked about of the U.S.'s own flaws right now and challenges in its own democracy.
There seems to be an underlying notion that geography gives the Americas a homogeneous platform on which to build projects of integration. Yet, as we have seen, there are relevant differences among countries, with democratic erosion being a relevant one. Given that the state of democracy in the continent is not at the same optimistic point it was at back in the 90s, how should the idea of the Americas look like beyond geography?
I always make the joke is you don't define multilateral organizations or integration simply by geography. I live in a mixed neighborhood in London. I can't imagine if I were to get together, I don't know, just 60 of my closest neighbors would necessarily form a functioning organization just because we live close to each other. Hey, you, you're a drunk and you're a wife beater, but let's all get together and let's hang out. Proximity does not mean equal cooperation. Okay. Having said that, I do think there are, as I've been alluding to, some residual shared values. And I think there's scope, and this would be anathema to many Latin American leaders. But we've seen it, for example, the Pacific Alliance is an interesting experiment. It's sort of stalled now, but it's still ongoing. Pacific Alliance of Chile, Ecuador, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico is important in terms of integrating stock markets, educational standards, a number of things, and trade. It's only a small portion of regional trade. It's also important because in the context of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or now called the CPTPP, they got to shorten that, it's way too many. That's important. What it indicates, though, is that instead of trying to have some overarching alliance that stretches from one point of the hemisphere to the other, try to find points of common interest, and they may not even align in terms of the same barrio. It may be that you say, well, let's take migration, or let's take climate change. Actually, all countries are affected by it, but some countries are affected by it differently. The U.S. can start to build. Obviously, right now, Brazil under Bolsonaro, he doesn't give a wick about climate change or deforestation. But why not create a smaller community that is affected by it, to try to, in this case, particular adaptation for Caribbean and Central American countries, say, for example. And when you do that, you start to align this along more of national interests. In that, you may include, for example, you may find that you want to include Bolivia. Bolivia is suffering from, in particular, shrinking glaciers that's affecting water supply. And you lose that sort of difficult, forced consensus on issues like, say, democracy or other issues, and you ground it in one shared common interest. And then with that, I think you can forge certain identity, certain collective commitments that was important. Similarly on nearshoring, say, okay, which governments are with us? Okay, Mexico doesn't care right now that much about providing tax incentives. Well, how about Costa Rica? Are you going to do it? How about Jamaica? How about Dominican Republic? Whatever, and form that sort. Because I think we're trying to force a marriage here that's broken. And I think we need to figure out what are the partners, and I'm not arguing for polygamy here, by the way. What are the partners that would actually cohere in a way that would make that relationship work? And I think we're just trying to force it too much. We all are. I think we all are. The United States, and it ain't working.